You are listening to CFRC 101.9 FM, and you are listening to Prison Radio, your weekly prison issues, news, and analysis show. This week, I'm really excited to share with you an interview that I did with two people who are both involved in opposing prison and jail expansion that the Ford government has announced for Eastern Ontario. So, as many of you may be aware, the government has announced a planned expansion at the Quinte Jail, a new facility for the Brockville Jail, as well as a brand new prison in Kemptville on the site of the former Kemptville Agricultural College to allegedly alleviate some of the overcrowding in the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center. I caught up with a Kemptville resident who is a founding member of the Coalition Against the Proposed Prison, as well as Justin Piché, a member of the Crime and Punishment Education Project. And they both are opposing this prison. They're both organizing against it. And I also was able to attend a rally last week in Brockville where I saw all of the wonderful supporters that they have been bringing out to this campaign. I thought that both Colleen and Justin had some interesting stuff to say about the project, and I'm very happy to share it with you all today. Enjoy.
Hi, I'm Colleen Lynas, and I'm with the Coalition Against the Proposed Prison, which is a small grassroots organization comprised of residents who live in Kemptville, Ontario. And my organization is one of two grassroots organizations opposing plans to build a 235-bed maximum security prison on farmland in Kemptville.
I'm Justin Piché. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Criminology and member of the Criminalization and Punishment Education Project, which aims to reduce the use and harms of prison in the short term while working towards abolition in the long term.
Great. And I'm not sure which of you is best poised to do this, but if one of you could just walk us through for our listeners what the government does have planned in terms of prison expansion in Ontario right now.
They have billions of dollars of money that has been allocated towards the construction of new and bigger provincial jails and prisons in different parts of the province. So right now, the government has signed a contract for up to $1 billion to build a new, what they're calling a correctional complex in Thunder Bay. They currently have, at different stages of procurement, a expansion of the Quinte Detention Center that will cost up to $200 million. The construction of what they're calling the Eastern Ontario Correctional Complex in Kemptville, up to $500 million for that project, as well as on the same site, the Brockville Correctional Complex and an expansion to the St. Lawrence Valley Corrections and Treatment Center of upwards of $500 million. So right there, we're talking about $2.2 billion that's going to be spent on prison infrastructure in the province of Ontario over the next 30 years. And those are just a few facilities. They could, of course, announce other projects in the future. And there's also expansions to the Kenora Jail and the Thunder Bay Correctional Center. They're meant to be temporary construction, but they'll likely remain open given how these expansion projects typically work, in addition to the Thunder Bay Correctional Complex. So right there, that's money that we're not spending in our communities to improve our collective well-being and safety, that we're not spending on education and social supports, that we're spending on a costly, ineffective, and unjust approach to social harm, and the money it's going to take to operate those cages once they're online if we don't stop them, which is why it's important that campaigns that involve the Coalition Against the Proposed Prison in Kemptville and the jail opposition group in Kemptville, that they continue to move forward, that they continue to build momentum, that they build coalitions across the region in so-called Eastern Ontario, as well as across the province, to build communities, not cages.
Great. And why don't you each just sort of tell me what it is about these projects that you oppose? I think a lot of people would think that new infrastructure is kind of, good to neutral. So Colleen, why is your group opposing the Kemptville Jail project?
If we go back to the original announcement regarding the plan to build the prison here in Kemptville, it was made in late August of 2020, but it was made without any prior notification to the community that this was even being considered. And we heard from our mayor that she was given 2 or 3 days notice and advised that it was confidential, that she was not able to share that with the community. 2 or 3 days notice, followed by an announcement by Premier Ford and our local MPP, Steve Clark, who is also the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing. It was announced utterly shocking to the people within the community. So the very first objection we have is that when there's conversation about large infrastructure projects, publicly funded infrastructure, coupled with publicly funded and very expensive costs to operate these facilities, there should be transparent and open communication. And it simply didn't happen. It was presented as a fait accompli, a done deal. And we've been really working to try to, I'd say, peel back the layers of a lot of the misinformation that has accompanied that announcement and the talking points that we've heard from our own MPP, Steve Clark, as well as the Ministry of the Solicitor General, ever since they made that announcement. The other piece, if I can just add, that piece of land is actually farmland. So they want to pave over yet another piece of farmland. And this is typical of what we're seeing right now across the province. Ironically, our own MPP is also the minister who is going across the province issuing minister zoning orders, which are essentially taking away the local planning capacities of municipalities and communities. And this is what's happened here. That land was part of, is historical farmland, really, because it was part of the original Kemptville Agricultural College, and which dates back to, I think, 1917. And Minister Clark also knew that our municipal government, our council, very much wanted to purchase that piece of land and use it as part of a broader strategy to essentially revitalize what was the original college. And he, again, chose not to do so. So at the very earliest stages, it's clearly been a lack of transparency, a lack of proper public consultation, and a level of secrecy around a publicly funded plan that is, in my view, simply untenable.
Mm. And for you, Justin, I know your group cares a lot about the welfare and well-being of prisoners. One of the main complaints people often have is overcrowding inside jails. Can you explain why you still oppose additional beds?
So, I think it's important to note that for years, the province has been saying that it needs to reduce the number of its prisoners, and particularly those who are awaiting their day in court, who represent roughly 70% of people who are being caged right now across the province. If you were to enter any jail or prison, that's what you'd encounter. For every 10 people you'd see, 7 are awaiting their day in court, and others are serving short sentences of 2 years minus a day or on an immigration hold or waiting decisions regarding parole revocation and so on. When we think about this idea of crowding, there is considerable room with the current ways that our society is structured now, let alone what we could be doing if we invest more in people and communities, to dramatically reduce the use of imprisonment immediately. And during the pandemic, things that different ministries were telling us were impossible to do prior to the pandemic, such as ramping up bail releases and issuing temporary absences for people serving weekend sentences, those things were done. And within weeks of the first wave of the pandemic in 2020, the jail population in Ontario decreased by over 30% without a significant impact on the level of criminalized acts in society, which again just shows the disconnect that decisions about imprisonment have little to do with community safety. There's other things that are driving our decisions to put people in cages, and that's associated with structures of power, which in this context relates to colonialism, racism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, and ableism, and so on. So there is room to, through further bail reforms or other measures, investments in the community to prevent conflicts and harms from happening in the first place, to actually dramatically reduce imprisonment now. And those choices aren't being made. Instead, we're blowing hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, in fact, on a failed approach to dealing with criminalized acts. And there's other things we could be doing. We take calls, CPEP does, through the Jail Accountability and Information Line that we run on weekdays from 1 to 4. And we hear the horrific stories of things that are going on, the human rights violations that are occurring in the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center. So we're working with them in solidarity to try and reduce the suffering, but they're in a cage, whether it's old or new. They're going to be continually exposed to human rights violations and to violence. And, that's bearing itself out in even the new prisons like the Toronto South Detention Center, which has been called the $1 billion hellhole, or the Southwest Detention Center in Windsor, which is seen as the so-called flagship by the Ministry of the Solicitor General, which has people that have died there from overdoses, where people are continually being exposed to crowding in a facility that was supposed to be addressing that issue. So there's a lot of claims that are associated with the construction of new cages, and they do not materialize in practice, and we just rinse and repeat again. The Ottawa Carleton Detention Center was built in the early 1970s, and when it opened, it was said to be a rehabilitation unit. Well, how did that turn out? So, we need to be doing something different. And for us, rather than spending all these millions, billions of dollars on new cages, rather than spending $300+ per day per prisoner, or $110,000 per year per prisoner to lock them up, that we could be investing those funds in a better way to improve lives and improve our collective well-being and safety.
Can you tell me a bit about how your groups and others are working in coalition, and what other stakeholders are also present in that group effort to stop the jails?
Very early on, one of the things we realized is that we obviously needed to work with subject matter experts to counter the narrative that the Ministry of the Solicitor General had, as Justin pointed out early on, talked about how this was going to be a new way of doing corrections and state of the art. And it quickly became apparent, even just skimming old media releases, that this was standard talking points for what Justin pointed out is previously and very recently built failed correctional facilities. So we initially reached out to Justin via CPEP, and that has been a critical relationship for us. We sought early on, my group CAPP, to really be a platform for the various reasons that people were opposed to this plan. And so, for instance, we also have a relationship with Elizabeth Fry, Ottawa, that has also taken a public position in opposition to the plan for certainly to build the facility in Kemptville. And so that's really been our approach. We have a relationship with a local business person as well, and then a strong connection with the other local group, the jail opposition group, that's also in opposition. But one of our earliest tasks was really to get as much accurate information as we could out to people. And so we held, over the first 6 months or so following the announcement, held a series of 3 different public information sessions, and we invited members of not only North Grenville but beyond who were interested in the subject to join us. We had very, very high caliber of speakers, ranging from people in justice reform area to people talking about the importance of preserving our farmland in Ontario. So we were very pleased with both the caliber of people we were able to engage and the response from our participants. And one of the things I'd also like to add is being able to engage with organizations such as CPEP has really allowed us locally to raise the level of discussion and the quality of the discussion within the community about the false narratives that were being delivered by the government, but also just the reality of what the impacts would be. Very early on, in fact, at the announcement in August of 2020, Premier Ford touted this as an economic stimulus and how this would help the province and certainly Eastern Ontario rebound from the pandemic. And you'll recall we were in the middle of, deep in the middle of that at that point. And I still feel that's really rather cynical and kind of unsavory to associate the building of correctional facilities with economic development. We've also found that that's a false narrative, that's not backed up by the literature. But certainly, I think being able to engage with stakeholders locally, regionally, and now we're hoping to even broaden our reach across the province, really is helping us bring a voice to this issue. And personally, as someone who did not have any content knowledge really in this area, it's really shown me, and I think many of us in the community, that this really is the time to make significant changes. As Justin pointed out, experts know what needs to happen. In fact, the provincial government knows what needs to happen, and they fail. And I think if they build this new facility and they continue on this path, it's just going to mean another generation of politicians who don't take the steps necessary to start identifying alternate ways of supporting and funding people in our communities so that they don't get trapped in this horrible cycle of incarceration.
And I think, like, for our part, for CPEP, I mean, one of the reasons we jumped at the opportunity to get involved is early on, you basically had folks in Kemptville who were like almost accidental activists, if you will, that were brought into this saying like, hey, we don't want this for our town. And then trying to take that conversation, say, well, let's try and push this to expose folks to different arguments around imprisonment, how it connects to struggles around Indigenous self-determination and justice and decolonization, how it connects to the liberation of folks that have been mass incarcerated in these systems, Black people, LGBTQ2S plus people, how it connects to folks who are being criminalized for the drugs they consume or the mental health issues that they're living with, and so on, and basically making an argument that it's not just in your backyard or our backyard that we don't want the prison. It's not in any backyard. There's better ways of improving community well-being and safety. There's better ways of trying to enhance one's financial situation. Again, just coming back to this idea, like one of the selling points of this facility that was routinely deployed by the provincial government, and it's been done in the past by other administrations here, whether it's in Ontario or elsewhere across the country or even the world, is these economic benefits are overblown. One, because they drain tremendous amount of resources from our communities by diverting funds towards caging. But in this case here, we know that the literature demonstrates that often when new facilities are built, they're often built with economies of scale in mind. So they see a lot of staff transferred from other facilities. The ministry's admitted as much, that most of the staff that are going to be there in this so-called rehabilitative, transformative prison in Kemptville are going to be OCDC staff who don't exactly have a reputation for being anything but dehumanizing. So how's that going to work out? Huge contracts to build these facilities, to design them, to finance, maintain them, go to large conglomerates who derive the bulk of the benefit in their headquarters, which are not located in Kemptville. Comparable counties without prisons perform better economically than those with them. That's what the evidence shows. And even if we were to accept that a prison provides this permanent recession-proof industry for a town that contributes to the economy, which is vastly overblown, but let's just play this game of accepting this claim. You know, what is the morality of basically shipping people from communities like Ottawa, which is, they've already said, the vast majority of prisoners that are going to be held in the Kemptville prison are going to be from Ottawa. So we're shipping people down the 416, 45 minutes away from the communities where they live, away from their families. Many folks that are being shipped or that would be shipped if we allow this thing to get built, Black, Indigenous, racialized people. So we're shipping them to a rural, mostly white community. So for the government, they're saying that looks like economic development. That looks like transformative, quote unquote, corrections. That kind of looks like, to me, like slavery. That kind of looks like, to me, forcibly displacing Indigenous peoples on reserves. This is not what community safety sounds like. And if they want safer communities, they should build communities, not jails. They should spend these hundreds of millions of dollars. They should give it to the people. They should provide community supports, invest in education. This idea that we're going to make our communities safer by locking people up is patently absurd, and it's going to harm people. Prisons kill people all the time, and we need to be doing something better if we actually want to save lives and relate to each other in better ways and improve our collective safety.
Colleen, you're hearing what Justin's saying. I'm assuming it's not the first time you've heard some of these points. Does your group have a position on what would happen if the jail was just moved somewhere else? And what do you say to someone like Justin who's just saying it shouldn't go anywhere at all?
I can speak for my group. I can't speak for the other grassroots organization, JOG, and I can't speak for all of the people in the community. But certainly from our perspective, I think initially we absolutely thought it was a really poor choice of location, and we continue to feel that way. But for those of us in CAPP, we've also come to realize that this is not the answer. Certainly in the case of OCDC in Ottawa, it's become very clear to us the answer to the problem around what may or may not be overcrowding is actually to take the brave step to make those fundamental changes that Justin has talked about. Particularly, we were, of course, blown away. Very, very few people would know the number of people who are waiting a trial or sentencing who are sitting in our provincial institutions. So for us, it's become very clear that now is the time to make those changes. We're not abolitionists, but we respect CPEP's position on that. But we do believe very strongly that it's certainly time to take a different approach to the criminalization of people. And, I'd like to add, if I could, Justin talked about the issue of, shipping people down the 416 to Kemptville. And I think the lack of thought that was given from the government in terms of how this would impact both prisoners and their families was really quite shocking. We don't have any public transit here. Without a car, it's virtually impossible to come to Kemptville from Ottawa or anywhere in the surrounding area for that matter. And the other piece is the lack of the religious and cultural supports that, as Justin said, that a diverse and often racialized population should be able to access and require that they would have access to in a large metropolitan area, which is certainly just doesn't exist here. So, if I go back to transit, our concern is that families will be denied the opportunity to visit here. And I get the sense that that's probably fine from the ministry's perspective, that people will be reduced to using video access, I guess, where that's available. But certainly from our perspective, it shows a lack of forethought into how this decision will impact people.
Just to add to that, when you look at the few documents out of the over 100 pages that the Ministry of the Solicitor General identified as existing in relation to the site selection for the Kemptville prison, we only saw just over a dozen pages, I believe. So less than 10% of the records that were sought that existed in relation to this. They have a few maps in there that show that this site, of all the ones that were considered, was the furthest away from where they think most of the incarcerated people that will be held there are from. It's furthest away from the Ottawa courthouse. Even using their own logic, this really doesn't make sense, other than this was a vacant piece of land that the government owned, that they've just decided to try and reactivate this surplus land, reactivate surplus populations by criminalizing them or hiring them as jail guards, reactivating dormant surplus finance through these public-private partnerships to basically reproduce capitalist relations in this very concrete way of land use, to use the word of Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And, this is happening as well, despite the fact that the Brockville municipality had other plans for the land, despite the fact that it's located on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. So it's really, really short-sighted. It's also a tremendous injustice for whether it's Indigenous peoples here or whether it's the residents of Kemptville or the folks that are being criminalized and that are impacted by criminalization here in Ottawa. It's really a mess. What needs to happen going forward is to try and enact a moratorium on prison construction, not just in Kemptville, not just in Eastern Ontario with respect to what they have planned for Brockville and Napanee, but elsewhere as well, to try and engage in consultations with Indigenous peoples and other residents on how to actually weather and how to develop these lands slated for cages, and also how to spend hundreds of millions of dollars currently earmarked for provincial prison construction to actually improve community well-being and safety. This should be stopped, and we need to be having those consultations that haven't happened. And we'll be better off, and if through that communities actually decide they want to build new prisons, I suppose we would continue trying to advocate that this is not the right direction to go in, but they should definitely be restarting site selection processes if that's the road, the carceral road they go down on. But pretty confident that if we actually open things up, that communities would say they need something different and we'd be building something else other than prisons.
You are listening to CFRC Prison Radio right here on CFRC 101.9 FM. I am sharing with you an interview with two people involved in resisting the new jail proposed for nearby Kemptville, Ontario, Justin Piché and Colleen Lynas of the Coalition Against the Proposed Prison. I hope you're enjoying this interview. Let's get back to it right now so we don't miss any of it. If you want to find out more about this, you can get in touch with us, or you can check out both these wonderful organizations online. I'm sure they would love to hear from all of you out there.
So how are you going to stop it? What's the strategy? What do each of your groups have planned?
In terms of stopping it, I think what we've done locally and to some extent with some of the relationships we're starting to build with partners is we've presented an alternative narrative, certainly. And I think our narrative has been very fact-based, and we've been very proud of that. And again, I go back to the quality of the speakers that we've had at our events. And certainly the relationship with CPEP has been critical there. We have a rally planned for Friday, and I guess this will be airing post-rally. We're starting to push our message beyond just the local and really taking it more province-wide and really taking it more actively to both the Member of Parliament for this area, or Member of the Provincial Parliament, Steve Clark, as well as to Premier Doug Ford. And so the rally in Brockville on Friday is part of that strategy, which is really going to Steve Clark's constituency office and showing us a show of force there. I think he's been quite happy that most of the media, not all, but most of the media has been local. And I think he's also tried to take a lot of cover by sort of almost hiding behind our local municipal council, which made a decision early on that they would not take a position in opposition. Their position has been, there's nothing we can do. The province owns the land. The land is zoned institutional, which means we can't, it's already zoned appropriately. They've taken, unfortunately, a very hands-off approach, and I think that's actually been to Steve Clark's advantage, because he's been able to hide behind the fact that they're saying not much of anything. So we're going to really push to make it very, very clear that Minister Clark has failed his constituents terribly on this front, and is really refusing to listen to not only local voices, but voices of other people like Justin, who are saying, wait a minute, let's rethink this. This is the time to rethink this. So that's a big part of our strategy. And if I could add the interesting piece around taking it kind of more broadly across the province, there was a piece in the Star 2 or 3 weeks ago. The Toronto Star essentially profiled local opposition, but did seek comments from the Minister of the Solicitor General and from Minister Clark. And his comments really spoke to his attempts to discredit and silence both local opposition as well as other voices. And I think it had the opposite effect. It really made us realize how he's simply not listening, and that we're going to continue to really make sure that our message gets out to a broader audience. We're also really trying to engage, and with some success, some of the other organizations across the province that are really fighting this kind of top-down approach that, for instance, people who fought against in Stratford, the issuing of a minister's zoning order to allow the building of a glass plant in Stratford. And that local group was actually successful in stopping that. And so I think what we're seeing is a pattern of behavior with this government and this minister that we're really wanting to call out.
And I think in terms of CPEP, how we're kind of coming at this and working with others towards different kinds of futures for our communities, this project, what the government's calling Eastern Regional Strategy, which includes the infrastructure projects for the Quinte Detention Center, the new Brockville Correctional Complex, the Kemptville Prison, and so on. Those beds were originally supposed to be part of a new and bigger jail in Ottawa to replace OCDC. And we had organized amongst folks in different groups in the community here to basically say that if you're going to come to town and do this, we're going to fight you. And there's a lot of us here that are willing to slow down this process for you. And through different forms of organizing and campaignings, like we had 99 solutions for the first 99 days that Doug Ford was in office in terms of what else we could be spending $1 billion on that was slated for that new jail. And for 3 years, things were not moving. We had managed to delay what was first announced in May 2017 to its next iteration, which includes what's happening in Kemptville, to August 2020, right? So I think where the campaign's going now, there's been a lot of work at persuasion, hosting these public forums like Colleen's mentioned, news and social media, interventions, sheer amount of op-eds coming out of Kemptville from various different kinds of people has been really, really interesting to see, to say the least, in terms of just the level of engagement in opposition locally, local demonstrations. But in terms of where this is going forward, if Steve Clark and Doug Ford and the rest of their cabinet aren't listening, what we need to do is continue to build a coalition that spans the region, which is one of the reasons that this Brockville rally is happening, the province, and indeed across the country and elsewhere. And where persuasion doesn't work, without revealing too much of what could come down the pipe, you do have to look at other tactics. And I don't think that it's Steve Clark's interest to continue to barrel down this carceral road ahead of a provincial election in 2022 with what people are capable of doing as we build the coalition and as we build power to oppose things like new cages. So if he wants to go there, he'll be met with folks that are committed to doing the right thing to stopping this. And we'll see what that looks like, I guess, come spring or come the summer if they don't abandon their plans.
How is this being received in each of your communities? Maybe we'll start with Colleen. When you talk to your friends and neighbors in Kemptville about this project, how do you think people feel about it? What's your sense of the reception publicly to this?
Well, my favorite new phrase is knowledge is power. I think the more people learn, the more they realize that certainly the initial talking points about the benefits for the community simply aren't there. And I think I mentioned earlier, too, that we're proud to have said that we've raised the level of the discussion to also include the broader social justice issues and other social issues that really now is the time that we should be addressing. The challenge we face is, someone just told me the other day that they ran into someone who said, what's with all of the no prison lawn signs? So we have a campaign out in the community with people taking lawn signs. And so this person didn't even know about the announcement, which was over a year ago now, and the plan. So I think the lack of public knowledge about, apparently even, that this is happening, more importantly, the facts around it, that's our biggest challenge. And so we're really going to be continuing to work on two fronts. One is kind of that broader province-wide coalition and regional coalitions, and also continuing to ensure that we reach as many local residents as possible. And my experience is that as people learn the facts, they very much say, this does not sound like a good idea. And the reason can be varied. It can be simply they don't want to see it in this very small community, and it can be much broader. It can be wanting to save that farmland, wanting it to be used to the extent that it should be from a historical agricultural perspective. And for many people, it has become those broader social issues. So that's really, I think the priority is educating people, informing them. And it's quite a slog. It's amazing. Despite what has been actually really successful media coverage, certainly locally, very, very successful, there's still a lot of people who don't have the facts.
And Justin, your group works not just with abolitionists, but also spends time talking to prisoners and formerly incarcerated people. Do those folks want more beds? What's your sense of how that goes over in that community?
Folks who are calling the jail hotline, they're trying to find ways to either get bail or find ways to be released into the community with the supports they need, the basic necessities of life that many of them didn't have prior to their incarceration. So there's not a number of imprisoned people who are calling us being like, why are you opposing this? Just as they weren't when we initiated the campaign in May 2017, the NOPE campaign, No to Ottawa Prison Expansion. We work in solidarity with them to try and diminish the pains of imprisonment to the degree that we can and try and connect them with community supports through that work. But we all understand that even if you thought that a new building instead of OCDC might be better, that's still several years away, number one, so it doesn't impact people's immediate circumstances. And number two, they're sitting in a so-called rehabilitation unit asking themselves, how could we continue to be doing this kind of stuff? So there is some political education that does happen during our calls with folks. But for the most part, people want access to housing. They want access to mental health or dental care supports. They want access to education and income supports. They want access to community spaces that don't criminalize the use of certain substances and actually make things more dangerous for people. We're in the midst of this overdose period where folks are really dying from an unsafe supply of substances, and criminalizing it is not making things better. It's not changing people's circumstances. Even people behind the walls are overdosing. So if we can't control it behind bars, what does that say about our ability to control it outside in society? So people want better lives. They want to move forward in a good way, but they can't do that if we continually put them in these spaces, these carceral spaces, where we harm them and where people are dehumanized, all in the name of rehabilitation and reintegration. It's absurd, and we need to be doing better by them and for all of us. And hopefully we can collectively work to stop this prison infrastructure from moving forward so that we can be building something else.
I just wanted to add something that I had meant to say earlier, and that's just in regards to what we've learned, certainly as a group and for many in the community, is the absurdity that so many folks are sitting in provincial prisons or correctional facilities waiting for their day in court. That number is mind-numbing. And we also understand that tends to be more poor, racialized people, more vulnerable populations who end up with less access, for instance, to bail. But then the other piece that really has struck me, and really I've started asking myself as a society, when I heard that sometimes people are, the average stay isn't necessarily that long in our correctional facilities, whether it's 30 days or 60 days or 90 days or even 6 months, what are we really accomplishing as a society by doing that? And I think there's a laziness because and again, here I am learning, not an expert at all, but there's a laziness in the fact that we're literally doing the same things that societies have done for not only generations, but decades, for centuries. A lot of people who pose no risk to our society, and yet our only solution is to put them in jail for 30 days. So it would be lovely to see that kind of discussion take place provincially. I know, unfortunately, folks in prisons, we don't speak of it, we don't talk about it. And I think it's just such a shame, because I think if people really start to put their minds to it, they realize that it really is important that we look at how we can better serve people. And the worry with the pandemic, if it's done one thing, it's shown us just how profound the inequities are in our society. And it's so disheartening to think that they're willing to invest all these billions of dollars into this system Where will the cuts come? Well, they'll come at the expense of the very people who often are from populations that end up being unduly incarcerated. Anyway, I'll stop there. I just feel that's really important because it's probably one of the most profound lessons that I've learned through this process.
Thank you so much. If people are interested in what you each have to say and would like to find your groups, whether online or elsewhere, how can they find you or get in touch with you?
My organization, CAPP Kemptville, can be found. We have a website, cappkemptville.ca, and we also have a social media presence on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, our latest edition. And we really encourage people to visit us, our sites, our website, and engage in the conversation. And on our website, you'll also find our email address. And so people are certainly welcome to connect with us by email as well.
And you can find out more about the Criminalization and Punishment Education Project by visiting www.cp-ep.org or visiting CPEP Group on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram.
That is all the time we have today here on CFRC Prison Radio. As always, if you want to get in touch with Prison Radio, whether it's because you would like to send a song request or a message for next week's Calls from Home edition of CPR, or whether it's just because you have news tips, ideas, poetry, anything that you would like us to share here on Prison Radio, please, please, please get in touch. You can email us, cfrcprisonradio@riseup.net. You can write us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. You can give us a call and leave a voicemail on our voicemail line, 613-417-3359. Or, as always, you can write to us. CFRC Prison Radio, 427 Princess Street, Suite 409, Kingston, Ontario, K7L5S9. So do send all those messages and song requests in before next week's Calls from Home special, but also do get in touch if you have thoughts about tonight's program or ideas for future content. We love hearing from you. From Embers is next here on CFRC 101.9 FM.
Deception annoys me. Deception destroys me. The Bill of Rights froze me. Jails, they all know me. Frustrated are churchmen. The saving of soul men. The tinker, the tailor, the colonial governor. They pull and upon me. They're seeking to draw me away from the roundness of the light. Civil servants, they thrive off my body. Their trip is with power, back bacon and welfare. Police, they arrest me. The trailers to test me. Pollution, it chokes me. Movies, they joke me. Politicians exploit me. City life that jades me. Hudson Bay fleets me. Hunting lost freak me. Government is bumbling. Revolution's rumbling. To be ruled in impunity is tradition, continuity. I pity the country. I pity the state. And the mind of a man who thrives on hate.
This is Nancy Kilpatrick, and you're tuned to CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston.
Help CFRC Radio help the Queens and Kingston community. Your donation to CFRC Radio empowers the volunteers of our community. CFRC provides free PSAs for local nonprofits and community events, and free training and support for volunteers at the station. Support CFRC, Kingston's volunteer-powered radio station. You can donate in person by dropping by the station at Laura Carruthers Hall on Queen's campus or online at